very happy to have you here for our new seminar that we also restart in this semester, Essential to Society, Franco-German and European Perspective on the social repercussions of the crisis, with a presentation today by an old friend and colleague of mine, Adam Tooze, who is professor at Columbia University since 2015 and the director of the European Institute there. He taught before at Yale, modern German history, and before in Cambridge, having got his PhD at the London School of Economics. As an economic historian, he is well known today, not only in Germany, having worked at the start on German history and the statistics in German history, and then opening up the scope of his studies to a broader, well, let's say, Western and global perspective. I just mentioned two of his most important books in the last years, Deluge, The Great War and the Remaking of the Global Order, published in 2014, and the book Crashed, about the financial crisis, how a decade of financial crisis changed the world, a prize-winning book that was really well received all over the world. Adam is a very prolific author, not only with his books, but also with more journalistic interventions and texts. And I just want to draw your attention to his website. You can see it on the slides, adamtooze.com, also, where you can find a lot of his texts that he published during the different years. A very interesting piece of work and texts that have been published also about the topic of today's talk. But today's talk, as he will explain us, is or considered to be part of a new book project, but I leave it to him to present us that. We are very pleased that Mary O'Sullivan from the University of Geneva has accepted to introduce to the discussion with a commentary. Mary is since 2010 professor of economic history at the University of Geneva. She has, among others, published in 2016 the book, and you can see here the title, Dividends of Developments, Security Markets in the History of US Capitalism, 1866 to 1922, published with Oxford University Press in 2016. And she's currently working together with Catherine Cheng on a project about the uses of the past in international economic relations. So thank you both of you for your acceptance to talk to us today and be part of our very vivid seminar series that we started already in May, in which we try to give interdisciplinary looks on the contemporary crisis and the COVID SARS-2 pandemic. I think it's very interesting to have with your paper, Adam, the vision of an economic historian who tries to put this crisis in the broader perspective of what has happened since 2008, and even in a longer historical perspective, how our different governments, how central banks have interacted during the crisis in order what they try is to save economy. But the floor is yours. Thank you once more to be here, and all of you, thank you of joining us today.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Is that the thumbs up? Yeah, okay. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here, in inverted commas. Wonderful to be a guest of my very old friend Jakob Vogel and the Centre Marc Bloch in Berlin. It's funny and touching in a way how even within our new world of Zoom, there is still a local sense to these calls. It's particularly gratifying, a real pleasure indeed, to see so many familiar names from Berlin on the participants list. I particularly am touched by seeing Hartmut Kelbler there, whose seminar was one that I attended at the Free University of Berlin, I think in the perhaps spring semester of 1990. So when Jakob and I were getting to know each other, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm giving what I have to say is the shortest of all possible talks about a huge topic which is rapidly developing before our very eyes, whose development touches us all directly, from which we have, in other words, absolutely zero distance, either in time or in terms of our personal entanglement. I'm going to be speaking in rapid fire, which is my habit anyway, but I'm going to try and keep this as close to 20 minutes as I can. The ideas I'm going to be sketching are therefore nothing more than stenographic notes towards what you might think of as, in the German sense of Verortung, a attempt to kind of historically localize and intellectually localize the problem that we're dealing with. And I'm going to use as a sort of sleight of hand, as a starting point, the fact that the IMF in the spring, in the sort of eerie, slightly ghostly spring meetings that normally are the great rallying point of the greater the good and in the world of money in Washington, D.C. this year, and obviously on Zoom, pronounced this slogan, 2020, a global crisis like no other. It has become, if you like, the organizing idea or a key piece of rhetoric in the IMF's response here. Kristaleva Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, and Gita Gopinath, the chief economist of the IMF, on the platform in the spring of 2020 outlining this idea. And for historians, it strikes me, this ought to be an idea, a phrase to wrestle with. Because this is a bold historical claim, like no other, a global crisis like no other. It's also, in some senses, surprising to see it being advocated so loudly by economists, because the natural tendency, I think, and this is, of course, a schematic generalization about economics as a discipline, and maybe unfair in some ways, but there's certainly an aspect of the economic discipline which is profoundly skeptical about this kind of claim to novelty. And the two distinguished economists who perhaps highlighted that skepticism most dramatically and profited from it rhetorically as a device were Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff in their best-selling book of the last crisis, 2008-2009, in which they mockingly, as it were, pilloried the tendency of contemporaries to succumb to the vanity of believing that this time is different. To their credit, both Reinhardt and Rogoff in this crisis have indeed swung round to the position of strongly supporting the IMF in declaring an emergency, that this time is indeed different. And it's easy enough to see why, and I'm going to start my brief talk with just simply giving you helter-skelter, and Mary may want to follow up on this and critique some of my use of data, but just in a helter-skelter fashion, why, from an economic point of view, there's every reason to think that this is indeed a crisis like no other. Simply take the shock to global GDP, tracked here by way of proxies. So what we're using here is lockdown measures. We're then translating those into likely impact on global GDP, breaking that down by the territory to which this is happening. We've never seen a shock like this before. This is a 20% fall, we think, in global GDP. The Economist, in its slightly facetious way, has said probably on or around the 11th of April was the nadir of this crisis. And we may have seen a shock as severe as 20% of GDP at that moment. Now, how big is that in historical terms? How big is a 20% GDP shock? Well, one way of benchmarking that is to take the curve of GDP growth normally, and you can see, broadly speaking, it's a smooth line. It would be straight because this is some sort of an exponential growth process if it was tracked in logarithmic terms. But you can see that broadly speaking, it's very smooth. And that goes even for moments like the 1970s, which we think of a period of great turbulence, or indeed even for 2008-9, which is the tiny little ledge that you see there around the 2010 mark on this graph. So if one were to put a 20% fall in GDP in a matter of weeks on a graph like this, it looks like this. In other words, this is a radical discontinuity like no other that we have seen in global economic development since World War II. It is also radically different in another way, in that it is vastly more comprehensive than any similar shock that we've seen, arguably ever. There's an updated version of this which shows you both the intensity and the spread. So what we're doing here is we're counting the number of economies around the world against the total number of economies around the world, so standardizing for the fact that no total number of national economies has increased due to post-colonial independence, and simply asking how many of them are in recession. And in the spring of 2020, the World Bank estimated that it would be close to 95% of the world's economies. So that is a more comprehensive economic shock even than the one the world economy suffered in the 1930s. I think it's true to say that we simply don't know what the dynamics of a system are when it's shocked as comprehensively as this, because normally there are some offsetting tendencies in the global economy. One bit of the economy is growing as another is contracting. Not in the spring of 2020. Virtually everywhere was contracting, even China at that moment. It is, in terms of the labour market, completely unprecedented. These are data from the ILO. They show a 10% surge, a surge of unemployment globally to over 10% in the second quarter of 2020. If you cash that out, if you cash out the reduction in workers, head count of workers, and the reduction of hours worked in the spring of 2020, it's like nothing we've ever seen. Again, in large part because of its comprehensiveness. The American story of daily, weekly, monthly unemployment is special. I'll come to that in just a second. But I want, first of all, simply to emphasize the global nature of this shock. The Chinese and Indian labor markets in the spring of 2020 suffered probably the largest shocks any labor market anywhere in the world has ever suffered. It's difficult to count because both of them are characterized by large-scale informal employment. In the Indian case, as many as 70% plus of the Indian workforce is informally employed. But best guesses suggest that Indian unemployment in late April 2020 was as high as 25%. These are shocking numbers affecting hundreds of millions of people. We all know from our personal experience the impact on family life of the furloughing from education of 1.3 to 1.4 billion young people worldwide. Again, a shock like we have never experienced before. And in the advanced economies where we can monitor this, there is also another absolutely fascinating dimension to this, which is the social profile of those who lost their jobs. This is not an unusual crisis in the extent to which low-paid, more precarious workers lost their jobs. It is highly unusual in that it hits in a cyclical fashion, or it isn't really a cycle, as it hits the service sector, which is normally the bit of the economy which is relatively immune to cyclical variations because the cycle is driven by heavy industry and investment goods. And that means that it affects women more than men. This is the first time in American history anyway that women's unemployment has surged above that of men. There's a bitter irony in the fact that 2019 was the first year in which women accounted for more employed workers than men. And 2020 is the first recession that affects women more. It isn't simply the logic of numbers, it's also massively, of course, influenced by the sectoral distribution of this shock. And this is the picture of the world economy in the spring of 2020. In the second quarter, it's a little distorted because if you'd seen the first quarter numbers, you would have seen China also contracting. China experiencing a vigorous recovery already in the second quarter of 2020. But India, the UK, Mexico, South Africa suffering shocks that they have never before experienced in their economic history. Or rather, in fact, it turns out that the UK has in fact experienced a shock as severe as this before. But you have to go back, and of course the UK economy is one for which we have ample economic historical data. You have to go back in the British historical record as far as 1710. In other words, to the days of the wars of Spanish succession against Louis XIV, to find an economic shock as grievous as this. And initially I triggered to the idea that this was surely the result of the dislocation of an early modern economy as a result of the strain of warfare against the great Sun King. In fact, if you look back in the British historical record, 1710 is as grievous a shock as it was because this was one of the moments of climatic variation, kind of the last phases of the Little Ice Age. and the British agrarian economy of the time was not well set up to handle a shock like this. So picturesque images of the 18th century, but a disaster from the point of view of 18th century Brits. So easy, I think, to see why, from the point of view simply, if you like, as a positivist description of the shock, you would say this was a crisis like no other, and truly global, like a crisis no other. I want, in what remains of this talk, to, as it were, however, put layers of interpretation on that and suggest ways in which, as historians, rather than as economists, or indeed even as economic historians, we might try and localize the specificity of this shock. And I want to proceed in what is, frankly, kind of crudely speaking, a dialectical fashion, so propose thesis, antithesis, and then offer what I hope is some sort of synthesis to bring these points together under the sign of contemporary history. So the thesis is that this is a shock unlike any that we've ever seen before. And you can see where that starts from. And you can add to that, of course, the etiology, the origins, the genealogy of this crisis, what drives it. And of course, the simple answer that makes this unique is that it's a global economic crisis triggered by a disease, by the novel coronavirus. And I think as a shorthand, it will be widely accepted that this is the result in the broad terms of processes of the emergence of infectious diseases, which epidemiologists and virologists have been studying now for 40 years, at least back to the 1980s, where alongside the diagnosis of the climate problem, we saw the diagnosis within modern medicine, in light especially of the AIDS crisis of that epoch, of the new type of threat. In other words, the modernist promise that we would witness an epidemiological transition away from infectious disease as a major killer would not, in fact, be vindicated historically. And not only was there, as it were, the risk of accidental emergence of viral threats, but in fact, our entire modern societies were set up to systematically produce, exacerbate, and multiply the risks of infection from that kind of disease. And that, I think, knowledge, understanding, narrative, if you like, of how we relate to the problem of infectious diseases has acquired hegemony, as far as I'm able to judge as an outsider, within epidemiological and virological circles since the 1980s. So we got hit by a crisis that was fairly predictable. And of course, the contentious, but nevertheless increasingly omnipresent shorthand for this condition of living in a fundamentally destabilized relationship with nature, producing risks of massive blowback, is the Anthropocene. And it seems to me reasonable to say that the crisis of 2020 is a crisis like no other, because it's the first comprehensive crisis of the Anthropocene. And I emphasize all of those terms deliberately. Unlike the climate threat, which I don't think is aptly described as a crisis because it's a chronic condition, this is a crisis. And unlike previous climate-induced crises like hurricanes, this is Dorian of last year, 2019, this is truly comprehensive. Dorian devastated the Caribbean, places like the Bahamas are still recovering, but obviously the shock of this year is much more comprehensive. And the implication of this is that is rather ominous, which is that the crisis of 2020 may be a crisis like no other, but it may in fact be the first of a new kind. So what we may need to be doing, and that's what I think one of the cognitive struggles is, we're trying to come to grips with this crisis as the harbinger of other similar sorts of events to come, even if this right now appears to be radically novel. And then what I want to venture is an antithesis to that interpretation. So rather than viewing this as in this radically novel, original way that I've started with, what if we flip the tables as a thought experiment, as a Gedanken experiment? Let's try doing this the other way around. Abstract from the particulars. Look, rather than at the particulars, look at the general shape of the 2020 crisis, and what do we see? Well, what we see, I would submit, is an expert diagnosed mediatized threat, analyzed and dramatized through epidemiological models, the most dramatic and politically consequential of which is the team working at Imperial College in London, which flipped the debate about the response to the crisis in March with their predictions of 500,000 dead in Britain, 2.2 in the US. Not facts, not realities, but as it were, scientifically structured prediction as a driver. It puts in jeopardy, and I think the key point here is not the lives of, as it were, the entire population, but of key societal infrastructure. That's really the trigger for action. So the threat to the viability of the hospitals in this particular case. It triggers a massive collective reaction of civil society and the state. It's important to emphasize clearly both sides. It's a very unhelpful liberal construction to imagine the reaction to the virus as top down and then to ask, as it were, about the boundaries of liberty. The reaction is clearly collective. And that then poses a whole series of questions about whether the cure is worse than the disease, in the language of Donald Trump. That reaction triggers effects, the lockdown, the shutdown, whatever you want to call it, the virus-induced recession, which in turn then trigger massive counteracting interventions, unprecedented fiscal and monetary policy, which Jakob alluded to in his introduction, and spawns a debate which in fact goes as far as to draw analogies to war economies. That totality of threat diagnosed, reaction by society and government, and then counteracting policy response unleashes a comprehensive and contentious debate about societal institutions, relative values. Remember the intense debate about the revelation that shop workers or Amazon delivery drivers were essential workers, talk in incredibly unlikely venues like the Financial Times of a new social contract. Then feeding off those a variety of pre-existing tensions, that debate triggered by this series of moves drags in, if you like, in a process which one might describe as, I know, there's also a variety of different crisis theory discourses one might draws in other currents and other forces, so that by the summer we have vaccine wars intersecting with trade wars and tech wars, and in the Chinese-American case with new Cold Wars. And the result is an enduring unsettlement of the status quo, in which we then see a variety of different societal responses, which range from proposals for radical reform, deep reflexivity, flat-out denial, or a kind of conservative back to basics, which we're seeing in the dying days of the Trump administration, with Chief of Staff Meadows simply saying, we're not going to control this epidemic, so let's look for vaccines, and because we're going to basically treat this as flu, because we don't have any alternatives, so a sort of back to basics retreat from actual action. And if you view it, I think, in those terms, the question in my mind is whether or not this is new at all, or whether or not this crisis is not better thought of as a particularly radical instance of the reflexive crises that characterize modernity in general. This was a thought I'd like to, which was brought to my mind by reading Bonnet and Frezos's brilliant effort to historicize the Anthropocene in conjunction with actually living through this crisis. And they argue that rather than thinking in terms of a single great acceleration for thinking about climate change that begins in 1945 and then triggers a sort of great awakening in the 1970s, we should be, especially as historians, attentive to the way in which repeatedly in the history of modernity, back at least to the late 18th century, society has in fact generated problematizations, various ways for thinking about the entanglement of modern society with its natural foundations and the mobilization of nature as part of economic growth, and then repressed them, moved on past them, found solutions that were partial, and are labeled, as it were, the juggernaut of progress to carry on. And it were, as it were, a continuous accompaniment of the process of economic growth by its criticism. The question being, of course, why at various points it's more or less efficacious. And that mode of thinking, I think, about our current crisis itself has a history. So I was particularly struck listening to Dipesh Chakrabarty in 2015 delivering the Tanner lectures, invoking Karl Jaspers as a way of thinking about the climate change politics of our moment as epochal consciousness, a phrase that Jaspers coined in relation to his famous writing about the nuclear threat. And that, I think, then enables a sort of series of parallel intellectual moves to somebody like Reinhard Koselleck's Kritik und Krise of the same period of the 1950s. For Koselleck as well, of course, reflexive critical problematization up to and including the dissolution of existing order in a revolution is constitutive of modernity. And the book, after all, famously, he wanted to call The Dialectic of Enlightenment, only to discover that Horkheimer and Adorno had got there first. So I think if you were willing to push this argument as far as you might go, you might say that rather than with the IMF seeing 2020 as a global crisis like no other, one might actually see it as a magnification, intensification of a classically modern crisis type. And it might be worth discussing, though you might want to reject it as fatuous, but it seems to me that we cannot entirely avoid the question of whether or not a crisis characterized at least by these 7 factors, and there may be many others that we might want to introduce, is not in fact typical of modern problems. It seems to me that our current awareness of the climate crisis is incredibly closely analogous to this, with rather different practical consequences. But it seems to me one might even imagine great train wrecks of modernity like 1914, or the famous revolutionary episodes around which we tend, after all, to organize our chronologies of modern history in these terms. And by doing so, of course, also gain a degree of distance historically from them. That, however, leaves us, and I really now want to wrap things up in the last 5 minutes, with a rather uncomfortable and unresolved tension, if you like, between a thesis of radical novelty and an antithesis simply saying, well, this is just another generic crisis. Is there some way in which we might actually be able to make this more specific? And I'll say that in thinking about this, I have one model particularly in mind, which will be familiar to, especially to the historians in the audience here. Extraordinarily brilliant essay written by Charlie Mayer in 1990-1991 as a memorial to Tim Mason, the great historian of the Third Reich, that appeared in History Workshop Journal, in which he called an approach to the future history of the collapse of communism. And why I like this and why this is such an inspiration for me is that he simply starts from the premise that, okay, fine, we all knew that communism was impossible all along, right? And he talked to any economist and they'll tell you it couldn't possibly work. But of course it did work. So the question really for historians ought to be, why did it fail in the way that it did at the moment that it did? And that, in a sense, is what I want to offer some very sketchy, as it were, conclusions about in the last 3 or 4 minutes today. Because I think we need, as it were, a ofOctober. We need a more specific, localized account than simply either that this is the first crisis of the Anthropocene, or on the other hand, that this is just another modern crisis over and over again. And if you think about the way in which, this year started, it seems to me we were struggling towards that anyway. The world was full at the beginning of 2020 of crisis discourse, even before COVID struck. We were struggling to localize the persistent problems of the EU, and indeed the project of the EU itself was scrambling for a new legitimacy. America, which I, of course, where I live, has been living through an intensified sense of national crisis for years now. And if you look closely at the discourse that legitimizes Xi's regime in China, it is relentlessly focused on what they called a period of major change never seen in this century. That idea that China is entering really rough water is essential to justify his claim to authoritative one-man leadership. If you looked at a place like the Munich Security Conference in February of this year, the security policy counterpart to Davos, the theme of that meeting was Westlessness. We had an entire toolkit of terms to discuss our current problems, including climate crisis, but also populism, crisis of the multilateral order, trade wars, Cold War, a new Cold War. The world was redolent with a sense, I think, of a series of very, very profound issues that were facing us. And I think as a historian, cognizant of trends in recent Zeitgeschichte, in recent contemporary history, if you're looking to historically localize the moment of our current awareness of the problems of the Anthropocene, of problems of capitalist democracy, of governance of capitalism under democratic conditions, of the economic management of our societies under conditions of a fiat money regime, of this problem of power, and American power in particular, in an increasingly multipolar international order. If you consult the recent historical literature to help you understand where you should see, as it were, those problems first crystallizing and taking on concrete form, then I think most people's bet would be it's in the 1970s. And to me, this image here is, as it were, redolent of the moment that we're talking about. This is President Gerald Ford, Nixon's interim replacement, taking one of the highly controversial flu injections in 1976. 1976 is the first year in which flu was managed by a real-time vaccination program. But think of the dates which come together at that moment: the Club of Rome report, the Stockholm Conference, swine flu, the Trilateral Commission's report on the crisis of democracy, the problems, of course, of the Bretton Woods system, the multipolar order reshaping around the strategic alliance between China and the United States. And if one accepts this as it were, a moment of crisis, then of course we also know what as a historical shorthand, what the immediate resolution was. And it comes in the form of neoliberalism and the unipolar moment. But what I would suggest that we need to do is to step back from that and to accept another period piece framing of the 1970s and 1980s. Wolfgang Streeck is making a similar argument to the one that I am making here. In other words, that we are living now through the deferred consequences of a crisis postponed from the 1970s, except that to my mind, he misdiagnoses what the nature of that fundamental crisis is. What I would propose instead is that we orientate around something like Ulrich Beck's Risikogesellschaft of 1995-86, which offered us a much more capacious matrix, I think, for thinking about the problems of reflexive modernization coming out of the politics of the crisis of the 1960s and 1970s, and against the background of which we can recognize the neoconservative or neoliberal solution of the restoration of market order, the limitation of democracy, the restoration of American power as the unipolar anchor of the global system in the 1980s. We could understand that as a solution, but we could also, I think, see its limits in its unwillingness to essentially face the challenges of what Ulrich Beck refers to as second modernity head on. And what he will therefore diagnose, I think, in an extremely apt phrase in the early 2000s, as in sense a system of organized irresponsibility, organisierte Unverantwortlichkeit. And if you want, as it were, a flavor of that, which is particularly redolent of our moment in this particular week in the United States, cast your mind back to 2007, when Alan Greenspan, the legendary head of the Federal Reserve of the United States, was asked by a Swiss newspaper casually in the fall of 2007 who he would be voting for in the upcoming elections. And his response was simply that it didn't matter. It didn't matter who he voted for in the American election of 2008, because we're fortunate that thanks to globalization, policy decisions in the US have been largely replaced by global market forces. National security aside, it hardly makes any difference who will be the next president. The world is governed by market forces. The series of assumptions that Greenspan is making is, to our minds now, I think, simply hair-raising, but this was in fact a common sense position of the period in which he was speaking in 2007. And this very brief interview to me, which was originally highlighted by Wolfgang Streeck, is so telling because it, as it were, highlights the blind spots of that moment. And if you want, as it were, a way of understanding the specificity of our moment now and historicizing it, I would argue that that is indeed what characterizes our moment. What we're witnessing progressively, what we have witnessed progressively since 2008, and Jakob kindly referred to my book Crashed about the crisis of 2008 and its aftermath. The way I would read 2020 in light of that is the progressive unpeeling, the progressive, as it were, disintegration of the system of organized irresponsibility put in place in the wake of the crisis of the 1970s, bit by bit. You can't assume that financial markets will self-insure and stabilize. Not only in 2008 did that not prove valid, we saw it again in this spring, in March, in a truly dramatic way. Globalization will create structures of transatlantic finance and indeed global finance, which are systemically unstable. It also will hollow out and destabilize frames of capitalist democracy, and it will, as a result, make it absolutely crucial how people, including folks like Alan Greenspan, vote next week in the United States. The idea that, as it were, national security can be neatly parceled out as outside the frame of economic growth, because growth driven by markets is irrelevant to national security, has been profoundly invalidated by the surge of China, which from the point of view of American policymakers is almost as important this year as COVID. And the idea that, as it were, it would provide a stable environmental framework for itself, and that we could find ways of internalizing those risks by way of various types of synthetic markets, may indeed still be a future possibility. But if Lord Stern was right to say that climate change is the result of the largest market failure in history, then one would, I think, in light of the experience of this year, have to say that the failure to invest adequately in public health runs climate change a close second. And the crucial difference between the two is the time scale on which they operate, which, as far as climate change is concerned, is still a matter of years or decades, whereas we have discovered to our cost with the virus, it's a matter of days and weeks. And it's the sudden intensity of that realization, I think, that marks this year the coming home to roost, if you like, of the long forecast problem of emerging infectious diseases as a systemic threat, which truly marks this year in its historical specificity as a moment of crisis. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Adam, for your very interesting talks and your preliminary thesis that you're putting out here. Very interesting thing to discuss. And I just give the word over to Mary O'Sullivan, who will comment on your paper, and then we start the discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me just check that you can see my screen. Okay, good. So let me begin by acknowledging the kind invitation by Jakob Vogel to contribute to the seminar, and to say what a pleasure it is to finally meet, at least in a virtual sense, Professor Adam Tooze, whose work I have read and admired for some time now. I'm preparing my remarks on what Adam Tooze has to say about the crisis of 2020, this global crisis like no other. I should say that I relied mainly on a draft of the introduction to the book he's writing. And for me, the most interesting feature of that introductory text is Tooze's discussion of the character of the crisis. As you heard from him there yourselves, he notes that the most straightforward way to characterize this historically unique shock is in terms of its immediate driver, that is the coronavirus and the COVID disease that it causes. And as you heard, if you accept that interpretation, the ominous implication is this is the first crisis, comprehensive crisis of the Anthropocene, but it's unlikely to be the last. Now, that's the interpretation of the crisis, I think, that you could characterize as if not the conventional diagnosis of the 2020 crisis. But Tooze suggests it's not the only one we should entertain. And that's because of the second remark he makes here, which is that if you think about what happened during this crisis, the real crisis was not that old vulnerable people died of pneumonia. I paraphrase him here himself. It's really how we collectively internalize these events, what sense we made of them, and the gigantic collective response that resulted from that sense making. Now, I'm sure that Adam Tooze chose his words very carefully here, because when he makes the same point a page later, he uses exactly the same words again. Worldwide, 1 million people, overwhelmingly old and vulnerable, died of COVID by September 2020. That's very sad, but is it a crisis? Still, however carefully chosen these words were, they still have the power to arrest the reader. And that tells us he's on controversial territory here. This kind of thing has been said, of course, but it is not part of the lexicon that people like Adam Tooze and you and me are expected to use in speaking about the crisis. Trump supporters and other deplorables, perhaps, but not university professors or liberal public intellectuals. But that's precisely why I think that Tooze is pointing in the right direction. What disappoints in the introductory text, however, is that he doesn't take us very far in moving in this direction. His reference to philosopher and psychiatrist Karl Jaspers gets us the notion of epochal consciousness, as you heard. However, the concept is not really mobilized in the text to offer much analytical or historical insight into the collective process of crisis making that legitimated the gigantic and unprecedented collective response we've observed. Far from obtaining that insight, in fact, the text seems to reduce the analysis of collective consciousness to our perception of being in a crisis or not. And what is lost in doing that, to my mind, is not only the possibility of addressing the question that Tooze himself asks about how the risk of mortality for the old and vulnerable was transformed into a societal crisis. We also get no grip on other important questions about the way in which the crisis we face has been construed. Why, for example, did we start talking in the public sphere about science in the singular, the science, when scientific uncertainty on the transmission of the virus and its implications for disease seemed to preclude robust and settled scientific views, never mind an orthodoxy that could be described as the scientific view? Why is there such a strong, even instinctive appeal to moral judgments to characterize the behavior of those who are contaminated with the disease, as we've seen in many countries when it comes to people between the ages of 15 and 30? And how is it that we've come to believe so fervently in the likelihood of finding an effective vaccine in the foreseeable future, so much so that it seems to be the premise of all of our strategies for containing it, although developing an effective vaccine is a task that remains fraught with uncertainty? Such questions are about the very fabric of our collective consciousness of this crisis, and they surely should be dealt with in a book that seeks to get at its character. Addressing them, I think, would offer a richer foundation from which to move to where Tooze wants to take us next. How we diagnose the character of the crisis, as Tooze rightly notes, has major implications for how we situate it in historical perspective. While a diagnosis that emphasizes the virus as the cause of the crisis might suggest it is historically unique, a diagnosis in terms of collective sense-making suggests many historical parallels. As Tooze tells us, and I quote, "This mode of crisis and this mode of narrating them is a recurring feature of modern history." To try and reconcile these two points of view, Tooze suggests we look to history to help. If you focus on the months leading up to the crisis of 2020, you might be tempted to say that the world was already in the throes of a nervous breakdown before coronavirus emerged. Tooze lists a plethora of anxieties, including international political inaction on the environment, Brexit, Trump's election, tensions brewing in trade relations, all of which lead him to suggest, as you see here, that there was the sense of something coming apart. That consciousness, he says, was widely shared even before Corona. Then he goes on to recount how various people have tried to explain this coming undone, evoking discussions of a crisis of globalization, a crisis of democracy, and so on. And while there's value in these different framings, he suggests it's even more illuminating to anchor ourselves on an earlier historical point in the 1970s. So what you expect to hear as a reader is a somewhat longer historical perspective. And Tooze, the historian, steps in here, much the way he did in his previous book, by offering a characterization of the 70s as the confluence of four crises that brought many features of the post-war period to a decisive end. Even though what ensued seemed like a period of confusion and obscurity to many commentators, Tooze argues that it was really a radical new beginning. And here it is Tooze, the social scientist, who takes over the story to lay out the ensuing consequence in terms of a sequence of historical events now in the service of a social theory. Well, what theory? Another Germanophone scholar, sociologist Ulrich Beck, enters here with his theory of the risk society. Because Tooze believes that the reality we inhabit is captured well by Beck's description of the dilemmas of a society shadowed by invisible macroscopic risks, risks that largely result from the inextricable entanglement of our societies with science and technology. Tooze refers to this reality as a true modernity and suggests that the dilemmas created, the duality of constraint and agency that it represented, have been visible since the 1970s. However, we initially confronted them through what Tooze calls a neoconservative, business-led vision of capital stabilization, a posture that he describes as organized irresponsibility following Beck. It was the undoing of this organized irresponsibility that gave the impression that the world was on the edge of a nervous breakdown in the months leading up to the 2020 crisis. However, it was really the corona shock that found us out, since it made unavoidable the questions we had refused to answer. There he ends his introduction, and there he largely ended his presentation, rather abruptly it seems, but with the implication being pretty clear, at least when to me as a reader. What Tooze is suggesting, I think, is that thanks to the 2020 crisis, new possibilities have opened up that give us the opportunity to meet the challenges of true modernity in a new way, through, one might imagine, organized responsibility. Let me say, stepping back from this argument, that for someone who is deeply interested in the history of science and technology, as I am, these claims need a little bit more development, and especially historical grounding, if they are to be persuasive. Or put differently, this kind of formulation that we get in Beck may be convincing enough as social science, though one might raise doubts even about that, but it's certainly not very convincing as history. But instead of focusing my attention here, let me turn instead to the sources of Tooze's optimism about the possibilities for organized responsibility as we move forward from the 2020 crisis, whatever that may be. As you can see, that optimism is largely grounded in his analysis of economics. What we witnessed, he argues on page one, is a profoundly ambiguous experience, a disorienting experience that was painful, chaotic, but also in unexpected ways empowering. Specifically, though it was traumatic, it cost trillions of dollars, but that showed that it was possible. It showed that it was possible for states to find ways to pay the bill. What I'd like to do is to spend a few minutes asking about whether this optimism is grounded, or asking how this optimism is grounded in Tooze's analysis of economics. Analysis is not really the right word, perhaps, to use here, because what is offered is not so much an argument that proceeds in analytical terms, but rather in rhetorical ones. And since Adam Tooze is not the only one making these kinds of claims, I have given this line of economic reasoning a name. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So here are the enemies. Strong views about the rules that bound economic interventionism that have been cast as an orthodoxy for decades or more. All of which have been overturned in recent years, not just by the 2020 crisis, but some of them during the recent global financial crisis. It is true that these pretension that these constraints exist, that they are hard and fast constraints that we must operate within. It is true that it is no longer possible to argue that there is strong evidence to argue that economic interventions must be kept within the strict limits defined by the rules. In fact, it's not clear that there was ever such evidence. But that is not the same as saying that there are no constraints. And that is more or less what Tooze seems to be saying, and indeed has said in other fora. What I would purport to say here is that we cannot know whether the money stock as a percentage of GDP can indeed be unlimited. If we focus on that particular example, perhaps I can illustrate the point. We can ask the question in the following terms: how much money can you create? Thanks to Thomas Piketty in his recent book, we can see that this must be phrased as a question to which we should assume that we do not know the answer. Piketty's picture ends in 2018. And what you can see from this picture is that we were already at historically impressive levels in terms of the scale of central bank balance sheets by 2018, in the wake of the global financial crisis. The only times we had gone higher, and then only for European countries, was during the two world wars. But that was before the 2020 crisis. If we look at the Fed's balance sheet since then, you can see the extraordinary scale of what has happened since. With as much money being injected into the economy in the space of a few short months as in the 5 years after the global financial crisis. That brings the scale of central banking assets to levels only witnessed in certain European countries during the world wars. And presumably no serious historian of the German economy, as Tooze is, would tell us that such levels of monetary expansion should give us no pause. But even if you forget about whether there are any lessons to be learned from history on the scale of the money stock that the economy can support, even if we focus on the here and now of monetary expansion, you'd have to follow the money to analyze what happens to it, to know whether so much of it is a good thing. And anybody who's been watching the stock market over the last few months has a fairly good idea what I'm thinking of in this regard. There's much more to be said in this regard, but the general point I want to make here is about the need to turn away from rhetoric into analysis to make the economic part of the argument compelling. And this is all the more relevant if we take seriously Tooze's claim that this is only the first crisis of the Anthropocene, the first of many that we can expect to follow. If we buy that argument, it would seem rather important that we don't run out of whatever economic ammunition we have before we've even solved what may end up seeming like a rather minor crisis when we see what the Anthropocene is cooking up for its next act. I have only 10 minutes at my disposal. I'm almost out of time. So let me bring my remarks to an end by turning my attention away from the content of Adam Tooze's new book towards the author himself. I happen to have moved apartment in the last few weeks, and in doing so, I often interrupted the tedium of packing and unpacking by rereading books and essays that I had forgotten about. One essay I reread with pleasure was George Orwell's Why I Write. And as some of you may know, Orwell offered several answers to the question that seem relevant here. I presume it is not terribly controversial to suggest that the relevance of the first three motivations seems clear in the case of this book, as it does for most of us. The desire to seem clever, to be talked about. Who can doubt the aesthetic enthusiasm that Tooze brings to his writing? You can see that in the use of a word, disinhibited, which is a word you don't often find in texts written by economic historians. And the right arrangement is very much clear in the type of writing that he excels in. Attention-grabbing, serious, but never very confusing. Historical impulse, the content of the introductory chapter, is all about that. It's about the importance of recognizing this moment as a crucial moment in the history of our societies. But the issue I really want to ask about is about political purpose. In reading the chapter, I had the strong impression that Adam Tooze has a very definite idea of his political purpose and political audience. Here you see how Orwell characterized the role of political purpose in his writing. And this is very much a sense that you get from reading the chapter by Adam Tooze. What I would have liked to see, however, is some explicit reflection on the implications of that purpose and audience for what he is writing and how he is writing about it. To put it a bit more sharply, the occasional reference to Davos or the spring meetings of the Bretton Woods Institutions made me wonder about a point that Tooze himself made in one of my favorite pieces of his. In a review of Barry Eichengreen's Hall of Mirrors, published in the New Left Review in 2015, Tooze suggested that the book was most interesting when read as a voice from within the turmoil in the economic establishment generated by the global financial crisis. Does Adam Tooze think it is fair to ask him a similar question in 2020? Will his new book be more interesting as a book about the turmoil within the liberal international elite, or about the turmoil within the world in which the rest of us live? Thank you. The turmoil within the world in which the rest of us live, of course.
So thank you very much, Mary, for your comments. I would like to go back to Adam's introductory remarks and say that we are here now in the middle of a very spectacular crisis, and of course it is not easy to have or to step back and to try to give your interpretations of what is going on. And I think it was very interesting to have both of your views and standpoints coming out from your work. Perhaps Adam, inside a debate, as you suggested, Mary, at the end, that has going on as somebody who is very often doing and giving his commentaries on the ongoing evolutions of not only the financial markets but of world economy in itself. I found it very interesting to have these kind of questions coming from a review article that Adam wrote about the question of the voice from within. I don't know, Adam, whether or not you want to answer to these comments and give your vision of these broader implications of your work and your position in it. Of course, as we have said before, this is the beginning of a discussion that you are entering now for your new book. So we would be very happy to have your remarks on that.
I would love to. Mary, could you unshare your screen? Because right now I'm talking to the slides. Thank you so much for that really wonderful comment. If you wouldn't mind sending me it, it would be a huge help. I don't want to take up too much time because there's such a wonderful group of people on the call, and I would love to hear from them too. But I do think I'd like to respond to three elements of Mary's reaction critique of my little short talk. I don't mean to sound defensive, and the comments don't actually make me feel defensive, because they were so well put and so extraordinarily instructive. But at least two of them are very directly answered in the rest of the book to come. So I take your point about, as it were, not casually making this move to say, well, the crisis is not really the crisis of a million old vulnerable people dying, but the reaction of society. I'm glad that you actually sort of green-lighted that move, because I do feel anxious about making it, but it seems essential to me to understand this crisis that way, because it's very difficult to sort of provide any systemic, as it were, rationale, while the death of folks in care homes should provide a stimulus to the sort of extraordinary historic shock that we've seen. So what I do in one of the immediately following chapter is to provide, as it were, an analysis of what you might call a sort of doomsday machine, in the sense that it is a series of essentially contradictory impulses that are institutionalized in various ways and which were triggered in a very unexpected way. Well, unexpected despite endless warnings. In fact, the warnings of epidemiologists and crisis managers are part, I would say, of this complex mechanism that was set up to produce this, in some sense, really bewildering reaction. And so I do try and lay that out, and it has to do essentially with the politics of, you know, the epidemiological transition, which people in the advanced economies have indeed profited from. Our complete inability politically, collectively, to arbitrate the trade-offs that arise. I mean, extraordinary difficulty in articulating a politics that would enable us in an acceptable, morally acceptable, even reasonable way to arbitrate the question of how many people should die so that we can restart the economy. It's a problem we can solve at the level of licensing individual drugs, perhaps, but one that I think we collectively have no real resources for dealing with. And so you see, you know, one effort after another to adopt a kind of hard-nosed realism, herd immunity or whatever, crashing into the reality that it's clearly unacceptable to govern in a way which would premeditatedly allow 500,000 people to die. And then a series of more specific institutional logics, which I did very, very briefly gesture to, but I think the pivotal centrality of a series of institutions, notably hospitals, in anchoring what we take to be normality. And the you know, to my mind at least, the, as it were, true trigger of panic in March and April are specific scenes from medical settings of triage, of the inability of hospital wards to cope, is, as it were, the impending risk of institutional failure at that level, which is a little bit like the too big to fail logic of Lehman going down. In other words, specific institutional anchorings of normality are crucial and they have to be defended. And we're willing to pay virtually any price to do that in certain settings. So that's the first. I totally take your point that logic needs spelling out if that argument is to have any legs at all. I do my best to do so at a structural level. I'm not a cultural historian. I'm not the person you would turn to learn about 21st century notions of death, but I could perhaps be able to spell out some kind of logic at that level. The second point is completely well taken. Most of the book is taken up with an exploration. It's an extension of the argument of Crash about the macroeconomics of monetary and fiscal intervention since the spring. You captured the duality and focused on it perfectly. I am impressed by the duality of constraint and pressure on the one hand and the scale of mobilization. I entirely take your point, which is common, commonly shared, I think, on the progressive side of politics, that QE in particular and central bank intervention is a very mixed bag from the point of view of its distributional implications. But I also would insist that we need to focus on a really rather remarkable moment in American political history when the Americans actually provide themselves for the first time with a welfare state that actually redistributes massively and very quickly. In other words, it's probably still true today that there are fewer poor people in the United States right now than last year. It's miraculous and very, very peculiar that that should be true. And it's, of course, incredibly fragile and will increasingly not be true as the consequences of the failure to do a second bailout become evident. And that possibility is slipping away literally as we speak this week. And if the Dems don't win the Senate in next week, then I would expect total obstruction. In other words, Obama administration on warp speed, and it will be a disaster next year. But no, the book is about the limits of that, and I try and address that as a global level as well. In other words, what has been the experience of the emerging markets? What degrees of autonomy have they been able to mobilize in this crisis, which have been quite surprising, because I was amongst those who were, as it were, beating the drum for an emerging market crisis in the spring, and it hasn't come the way that we anticipated. It's arrived, but in a rather different form from the one that we expected. Your last point about politics, I mean, this is sort of, I mean, this isn't the forum in which I want to kind of expound my personal political position, but your reading is acute and on point, and it's a point that people, of course, made about Crashed as well, especially readers from the left, especially people associated with the New Left. What kind of a book is this? Is this a book written from the inside? And I think, broadly speaking, I'll roll with that punch. I don't see any reason not to. It's simply, as it were, a descriptively realistic account of my position. I'm not, I will stretch in the book as far as I can, as it were, to mobilize in the way that folks inside this machinery, which in some adjunct way I have to, I think, frankly, acknowledge I'm part of, try and account for issues of global poverty, for instance. So in no way is this an account which is blind to the massive, dramatic social implications. But I would query, if I might push back, if I might be so bold, the way in which you drew the line between yourself and this group. I mean, on what basis do we exempt ourselves from that logic? And that's fundamentally what drives me. It's not that I have any particular affection for the folks at Davos or colleagues at the IMF, but I know them, I have regular interaction with them, and I'm sure that you, or at least your university or people in your department, definitely do. So like, I don't really quite see where we get to draw this distinction. My politics are Keynesian in that sense, in that they are reformist and about trying to think through the logic and our capacity to govern something like not the status quo in an unmediated way, but my politics are not even in an imaginary sense revolutionary. I don't indulge in that kind of otherness position. I think we are inside this machine, and our best bet is to try and govern it and run it as best we can. And that, to my mind, involves absolutely an advocacy for redistribution, for emancipation, for empowerment. And that is the position from which I hope that this sort of argument is articulated. It's making the best out of our existing situation, admittedly, but that's the logic. And also, I think, as it were, a relative contribution, in that list of things, as it were, that you illuminated, like, why do we write? There's also a kind of comparative advantage argument that I didn't see there. Like, why should I write about this is also a crucial question. And in terms of my comparative advantage, I don't see myself as a historian from below. I just don't think that's my particular skill set. But I think my relative, insofar as I have revealed comparative advantage, it appears to be in the ability to make explicit logics from the inside. And if that's a useful function, then I think of that as a useful political function, because understanding those logics from the inside is, I think, emancipatory fundamentally. Better that they are exposed than not.